So many scholars have argued that, quote, the racial nostalgia looms large in the American imagination, end quote. So what does that mean to you? And tell us a little bit about more about that and kind of break that down a little and think about it in the ways in which, there's been many gains in media and culture. So have we really fully moved past America's ugly past, or has the representation just become much more sophisticated in its presentation?
Oh my. So that's a lot. I, you know, Racial nostalgia, Paul Mooney, the late Paul Mooney, had a joke about all of these movies, Back to the Future, Back to me saying, I'm not going back. If depending on where I land in the time machine, I might be stuck, And I do think racial nostalgia is a thing because popular culture is driven by, there's a group of African-American philosophers who talked about this, and they have an essay called Cream, Cash Rules Everything Around Me. The Wu-Tang Clan talked about this, and popular culture is driven by a profit incentive. And what people are generally inclined to lean toward what is familiar. And if we understand that, we understand the reality of racial nostalgia. So when I think about racial nostalgia, I can't separate racial nostalgia from white supremacy, a time when these hierarchies were not blurred at all. They were completely clear. The lines were bright. The lines were broad. And so anything that hints at this kind of these hierarchies, and as Dwayne McDuffie once said, the kind of white male power fantasy that we see in comic books, as an example, it makes people feel better about themselves. I have to be careful. I almost felt myself digress to talk about critical race theory. And so racial nostalgia is a thing. And I think part of what we see in the disruption that we see in some of the recent really large scale major pop culture moments, in particular, for example, Black Panther, Watchmen, so on and so forth, is a way of returning to that racial nostalgia and weaponizing it in a very, very interesting way. So let's go back to the past, or let's look at the history, and let's talk about it or engage it or present it in a way that disrupts the kind of comforting mint julep sitting on the porch racial nostalgia that we sometimes see. The Watchmen was a long way from Driving Miss Daisy. And so I think it's very important that we understand the kind of pull that familiarity represents. People generally don't engage popular culture to have their realities disrupted, to have their assumptions about the world disrupted. That's not why people go to the movies. They go to the movies to be exhilarated, to be scared, to laugh, and so on and so forth. And if we understand the profit motive, then we understand why there still is the pull of racial nostalgia continues to exist. But the fact of the matter is, these articulations of the Black past and the Black future have proven to be profitable as well, because you can only mine the past in the same way so many times. For an example, as an example, I just finished watching Sweet Tooth on Netflix. I really, really enjoyed it. But you have the quintessential Black buck magic Negro character in the big man. And I'm thinking it's 2021. Do we still need to rely on these old stereotypes, right? So there will be some people that will find that image comforting. And, of course, there's that tension between the fear and the fascination, so on and so forth. But other people like us who will say, are we still doing this? Are we still doing this? So I think the racial nostalgia and these new articulations, the interaction between the two is very, very interesting. And hopefully we're leaning away from the same kind of redundant, formulaic representations of racial nostalgia and these old archetype characters, Black archetypes. Hopefully we're moving away from that, but we'll see.
Thank you for that. I did want to kind of probe you on something as I was listening to your response,
Oh, oh,
to
Lord.
kind of get a little more of your thoughts on critical race theory and what's been happening, and in this moment, and kind of get your thoughts on what's happening in this moment, what may happen in the future, and everything in between.
You're trying to put me on Fox News. I know what's happening here. So I first thought to speak to critical race theory when we were talking about racial nostalgia, and I'll tell you why. First of all, there's no need to engage in definition of critical race theory. People are arguing about critical race theory that have never read anything. Any authors have no notion, so I'm not going to do that. What I will say is I find it interesting the manner in which the opposition to critical race theory, in my mind, is driven at least in part by racial nostalgia. What critical race theory represents is a challenge to cherished assumptions about American life. Many of these cherished assumptions cannot be separated from the sort of the niceties, the way in which white supremacy is expressed in certain kind of historical niceties, which of course white supremacy is not a nicety, but it's expressed in that way. And so it is, critical race theory says, no, let's look at history and let's look at the intersections in history and understand the way in which racism is part of that fabric. You cannot concurrently have that kind of engagement, that kind of analysis, that kind of critique, that kind of truth, and at the same time have the kind of racial nostalgia that we're discussing today. They're mutually exclusive. And so it's clear to me that the choice that many are making is, it's in many ways it's anti-truth. They are choosing a truth that is limited in scope, that is familiar, and that is nostalgic. And so I think as we continue to have these debates, the Georgia Department of Education just adopted a resolution. I know Florida did, and there'll be others to follow soon. As we continue to have these debates or witness these debates, for those of us that refuse to even participate, I think introducing the idea of racial nostalgia is a very useful way to understand part of what's going on. People don't like anyone going into their family photo albums and asking questions about, well, who is that person and why are they there? Or why isn't this person? People just want to look in their family albums. Well, some of us can afford that. Some of us can't. And so that's what I was thinking when I thought about critical race theory and racial nostalgia.